Number 9. Mauritania Shipwrecks. In the small African country of Mauritania, the Nouadhibou Bay is littered with decaying hulks in all directions. Ships that were cheaper to disassemble than to illegally dump in a port. Nouadhibou is the second biggest town in Mauritania, but is rather impoverished thanks to a lack of employment prospects. As is often the case, economic hardship leads to corruption in local government and businesses. Large boats are expensive to dismantle, and ship owners discovered that for a small price, they could just ditch their unwanted boats in Nouadhibou's harbor. Ships were transported from all over the world to be abandoned in the shallow seas during the 1980s. There are about 300 rusting ships that have been left throughout the years, including a variety of boats like fishing trawlers, cargo ships, and Navy cruisers. Poisonous oils, paints, and rust pour into the bay's waters and have raised environmental concerns. But the abandoned ships have given a few unexpected advantages. In addition to the salvage business that has cropped up near the wrecks, the disintegrating hulks have actually offered new homes for fish and sea life, providing a much-needed boost to the city's fishing economy. Number 8. The Touth Electron. The Touth Electron was a 41-foot trimaran sailing vessel designed for the British businessman Donald Crowhurst to use in the Sunday Times Golden Globe single-handed sailboat race around the world. It set sail from England on October 31, 1968, and was found 252 days later in Jamaica without its captain. Records revealed that Crowhurst faced issues from the start, had been giving incorrect locations, and had stopped in Brazil to get his boat fixed after it broke down. After the repairs were finished, Crowhurst was on course to finish the race in first place, but all of his rivals were performing just as badly. Crowhurst wrote a 25,000-word manifesto on life before likely committing suicide by leaving his ship, knowing that if he won, race organizers would review his route and discover his lies and how he was in a deteriorating mental state. Number 7. The Unknown Sailor. The largest maritime mystery in Australia's history has been solved 80 years after the HMAS Sydney disaster. In November last year, the Royal Australian Navy reported that DNA testing revealed the identity of the Unknown Sailor, a body found in the cruiser after it sank with all of its crew on board during World War II. 21-year-old Thomas Welsby Clark was assigned to HMAS Sydney 4 months before it was wrecked on November 19, 1941. The warship's 645 crew members were all killed. 3 months later, Thomas's body washed up in a life raft on the coast of Christmas Island. For decades after, he was called the Unknown Sailor. Clark studied accounting in Brisbane before joining the Army and getting assigned to HMAS Sydney. Although he was originally buried on Christmas Island, his remains were later excavated in 2006. He was then placed at the Geraldton War Cemetery in Western Australia. The sinking of the Sydney resulted in the Royal Australian Navy's worst loss of life, the largest Allied vessel lost with its crew during World War II, and a massive blow to Australia's pride. The cruiser's disappearance has sparked discussion for decades, with many historians believing she was ambushed by a German warship. According to the official Australian government's investigation, both ships were traveling at 14 knots when the Cormoran, a German cruiser disguised as a Dutch cargo, decamouflaged and showed her battle flag before opening fire. The wreckage of both ships was found 112 nautical miles off the coast of Steep Point, Western Australia, in March 2008. Number 6. USS Conestoga. In 2016, the USS Conestoga was found in the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary off the coast of San Francisco, 95 years after the Navy fleet tug went missing with 56 officers and crew on board. The discovery solved one of the most confusing nautical mysteries in U.S. naval history. Conestoga left the Golden Gate on March 25, 1921, on its way to Tutuila, American Samoa, through Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. When Conestoga failed to show up in Hawaii on time, the Navy launched a large search near the Hawaiian Islands, the tug's destination. On May 17th, over 2 months later, a commerce vessel found a dilapidated lifeboat with the letter C on its bow off the coast of Mexico, sparking another search. The ship's strange disappearance captivated headlines across the country for months. The Navy finally declared Conestoga and its crew lost on June 30, 1921, when they couldn't find the ship or the wreckage. This was the last moment a U.S. Navy ship went missing without a trace while the nation was not at war. The NOAA Office of Coast Survey found a possible unexplored shipwreck in the Farallon Islands off the coast of San Francisco in 2009. NOAA then initiated a 2-year inquiry in September 2014, directed by James Delgado and Robert Schwema. During a trip in October 2015, NOAA verified the identity and location of Conestoga. Winds blew at nearly 70 miles per hour around the time the Conestoga set sail for Farallon Island. That's according to the weather logs. The tug was battling a storm and the barge she was pulling had been blown adrift by strong seas. This, according to a jumbled radio communication later received by another ship. The disaster, according to NOAA, sank while the crew tried to reach a sheltered harbor on the island. During the dives, no human remains were found, but Conestoga is protected under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act and the Sunken Military Craft Act of 2004, which forbids unlawful disruption of sunken military boats or aircraft owned by the United States government, as well as foreign military craft in U.S. waters. Number 5. MV Joita. The MV Joita was a 70-foot luxury yacht built in Los Angeles, California and launched in 1931. It was mostly made of wood with a cedar planking hull. She also had a cork liner which offered extra buoyancy. Because of the materials used, the ship was much lighter than the sea, so practically nothing could make her sink. On October 3, 1955, the MV Joita set sail from Apia, Samoa on the 270-mile trek to the Tokelau Islands. Because of a last-minute technical issue, only one of her 2 engines was operational, but the voyage was still deemed safe due to the short distance and nice weather conditions. Joita was transporting medical supplies and wood building components. 25 people were on board, including 16 crew members and 9 passengers, and the voyage was supposed to take 48 hours. But 3 days later, the ship was declared missing, with no distress calls received. For over a week, Air Force flying boats from New Zealand searched the region Joita was thought to be in, covering large expanses of open ocean, but they couldn't find anything. 5 weeks later, Gerald Douglas, captain of the commercial ship Tuvalu, discovered Joita more than 600 miles west of her intended path, drifting north of Vanuatu. The ship was half-flooded, significantly tilted, and no passengers or crew were found. 4 tons of cargo was also missing. The radio was recovered and set to 2,182 kHz, the International Maritime Radio Telephone Distress Channel, according to the rescue team. Theories as to what happened included mutiny, pirate attack, and a frantic escape from the ship, which flooded on its lower decks without sinking. These have all been listed as reasons for the Joita's abandonment, while some new accounts allege Japanese involvement, but none have been verified to this day, and no trace of its passengers has ever been found. Number 4. The Endurance. Scientists discovered and recorded one of the largest unknown shipwrecks in history 107 years after it sank. The Endurance, the long-lost ship of the Antarctic explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, was found at the bottom of the Weddell Sea in March of this year. In 1915, the ship was wrecked by sea ice, causing it to sink and forcing Shackleton and his men to make an incredible escape on foot and in small boats. Even after resting below 10,000 feet of water for nearly a century, the ship still looks the same as the day it went down in November 1915. The timbers are intact and the name Endurance is clearly visible on its stern. The seasoned polar geographer Dr. John Shears, who led the operation, described the moment cameras landed on the ship as jaw-dropping. He added, "The discovery of the wreck is an incredible achievement. The submarines had explored a designated area for nearly 2 weeks, probing some fascinating targets until eventually finding the wreck site, coincidentally on the 100th anniversary of Shackleton's funeral. The days after the discovery have been spent photographing the timbers and surrounding debris. The ship looks very similar to photos taken by Frank Hurley in 1915. The masts have fallen and the rope has gotten tangled, but the hull is mostly intact. Some damage can be seen at the bow, which is most likely where the ship collided with the ocean's floor. Under the Antarctic Treaty, the wreck itself is designated as a monument and must not be harmed in any way by divers or explorers. As a result, no artifacts from the wreckage have been brought to the surface." Number 3. L.R. Doty. The wooden steamer L.R. Doty sank in Lake Michigan during a strong storm back in 1898, killing all 17 people that were on board. The ship was never seen again until recently in June 2010. The wreckage was found by a crew of Wisconsin divers on the beaches of the lake. The search was carried out based on a 20-year-old tip from a commercial fisherman. The Doty was discovered in 1991 by a commercial fisherman that was catching chubs when he hooked a big object on the lake's bottom. He told a few others about it, but not much fuss was made since it was under 300 feet of water and, according to him, may as well have been on the moon. Around that time, he started collecting tales of Great Lake shipwrecks from a database of all master vessels lost on the lakes. He became interested in the L.R. Doty. Then he and his crew chose a day with decent weather and sent divers out to find the ship. All of the items the crew had on them in 1898 are still in the staterooms of the ship in the same condition they were left in. Unfortunately, there are also 17 human bodies still on board. None of the human remains were found when she sank in 1898, and it's believed that the majority of the crew hunkered down in the ship thanks to the 30-foot seas in such a small vessel. Because the waves were breaking straight over her deck, it's believed none of the crew were able to reach the surface. The wreck is owned by the people of Wisconsin and is both an archaeological and grave site. Divers are welcome to stop by to take pictures, but a salvage permit from the State Historical Society is required to remove anything. They've had little success removing artifacts because it's too expensive to maintain them, and there's very little interest in the pieces once they reach the surface. Number 2. SS Clifton. The SS Clifton steamer left Surgeon Bay, Wisconsin on September 21, 1924 to take a load of stone to Detroit. The ship was last seen by a tugboat on Upper Lake Huron that evening after passing through the Straits of Mackinac around 10:20 a.m. A sudden wind sprang up and swept across the lake. The resulting storm was fierce and unforgiving. When the SS Clifton failed to reach Detroit on time 3 days later, a search of the Lake Huron coast from Oscoda to Port Huron showed no evidence of the vessel. Wreckage from the SS Clifton eventually washed up on the Canadian side of Lake Huron, indicating the ship sank. The fact that no remains drifted ashore made investigators believe the SS Clifton sank quickly, leaving the men with little opportunity to deploy lifeboats. Her sinking was never fully explained, and her final resting location at the bottom of Lake Huron remained a mystery for over a century. That is, until September 2016, when David Trotter, owner of Undersea Research Associates, found the wreck just 100 miles south of the site where shipwreck hunters believed she met her demise. They found the Clifton on its side with considerable damage to its bow. Trotter didn't make the discovery public until September 2017, when he and his colleagues had thoroughly researched the location and documented their findings. Number 1. Mary Celeste. Captain Benjamin Briggs and the crew of the Mary Celeste, a commercial ship carrying alcohol, left New York Harbor on November 7, 1872 for Genoa, Italy. He chose 7 hand-picked team members as well as his daughter and wife. Sadly, they'd never make it to their destination. For 2 weeks after leaving New York, the Mary Celeste faced dangerous seas and raging storms. The captain made the final entry in the log on November 25th. Nothing was wrong at the time. But when the De Gratia, a British brig, discovered Mary on December 5th, there was no one in sight. When De Gratia's captain boarded the ghost ship, he found 3.5 feet of water in the bilge, the ship's lowest spot below the waterline. The shipment was whole, but several barrels were empty. Some believe the crew drank the booze and mutinied, but there was no evidence of violence. Others speculate the ship had been attacked by pirates, but no valuables were taken. In Arthur Conan Doyle's short fiction about the subject, an ex-slave captured the ship. But where did he and the crew go? Waterspouts and sea monsters were also considered. Despite these beliefs, no evidence ever matched any of the claims. The most likely explanation was that the fumes from the alcohol had blown the hatch cover off. Fearing for their lives, the crew probably abandoned ship. This would have been a perfectly fine explanation, but the hatch cover was securely fixed. Finally, in 2002, a documentary filmmaker named Anne McGregor looked into it. She rebuilt the ghost ship's drift and concluded the captain had a malfunctioning chronometer and was hopelessly off track. The Mary Celeste was 120 miles west of her intended location. McGregor discovered the ship had just been refurbished and that the coal dust and debris from the refitting had likely clogged the pumps that drained the water taken on by the ship. With the vessel off course but still near some kind of land, Santa Maria, the crew may have cut their losses and simply tried to save themselves by abandoning the ship and heading for land, with the pumps not working and no way to pump water out. After 130 years, the crew's mysterious disappearance and the puzzle of the Mary Celeste may have been solved. Number 8. Katyusha Rocket Launcher. The Katyusha was a shock and awe weapon used by Soviet troops in the fight against Nazi Germany during World War II. The Katyusha highlighted typical Russian tanks. It was basic, primitive, and ruthlessly efficient. Although Katyusha's rockets were inaccurate, the Soviets launched so many of them that they all managed to reach their objectives. The launcher's official designation was a BM-13. Because the BM-13 launcher was made at a plant named Vyazovye Komintern, it had the letter K on the side. The rocket launcher was nicknamed Katyusha, the Russian name for Katy, by Soviet soldiers after its famous folk ballad about a woman that was separated from her boyfriend during war. The Katyusha rocket launcher was a weapon of terror and fear. The rockets produced a horrible noise, and the Germans nicknamed the weapon Stalin's organs. The multiple rocket launcher was first developed in the 1930s. The Soviets initially intended to build air-to-air missiles for their aircraft. Ground-to-ground rocket research began only in 1938. Remarkably, the Katyusha rockets were launched from tracks instead of the more common tubes, requiring the rockets to be self-propelled. The exhaust gases in a tube produced pressure, which pushed the rocket out of the barrel. Because the gases evaporate over an open rail, the rocket requires a greater jet stream in order to launch. It took years to create a suitable propellant. The Soviets eventually agreed on a nitroglycerin ballistic powder. The Katusa rocket launcher was a state secret, and only NKVD, Soviet secret police operatives, were allowed to use it. The Katusa rocket launcher was inexpensive, simple to make, and simple to use. It could be carried across the battlefield by mounting it on trucks, tanks, or even tractors, which made it accessible and deadly. Number 7. V-1 Flying Bomb. The V-1 flying bombs, often called doodlebugs or buzz bombs due to the unusual sound they produced while in flight, were jet-powered winged bombs. The first V-1 flying bomb launched by the Germans during the Blitz dropped in London at 4:25 a.m. on June 13, 1944. The first one to hit town struck Grove Road, destroying the railway bridge and nearby homes while killing 6 people. The Doodlebug, or its German codename Cherrystone, was a weapon of vengeance and devastation, used to deal some considerable damage in the onset of World War II, despite its misleadingly harmless titles. A Doodlebug is a bomb with wings and unmanned aircraft. It resembles a cruise missile, but is still somewhat larger. The moniker Buzz Bomb came from the loud, roaring noise created by its pulse engine as it hurtled across the sky. Doodlebugs have been reported as generating ripping and rasping noises, but when their engines stop after a certain distance, they remain eerily quiet, as if they disappear without a trace. When the first V-1 was fired, people described the sound like a motorcycle or a steam locomotive straining up a hill. Residents reported the scene as a flaming plane sweeping across the sky with a spear of flame on its tail. 6 people were killed, 30 were injured, and 200 were displaced when the V-1 crashed onto Grove Road. The Great Eastern Railway Bridge that connects Liverpool Street to Essex was destroyed. Surprisingly, train movement was continued within 40 hours thanks to the deployment of a temporary bridge which served customers for 4 years until 1948. A plated steel blue plaque now hangs in its place as a reminder. The Greater London Council constructed the plaque on June 13, 1987, 41 years after the bomb dropped, after a proposal by Joseph V. Waters, who had a brother injured by the explosion. The plaque was later stolen and replaced with an English heritage ceramic blue plaque. This catastrophic incident and the extensive bombardment of the East End in general will live in infamy. Although remembering such a terrible event in history is tough, it's nice to know that Mile End Park sprang from the ashes of a wrecked Grove Road and its surrounding neighborhood as a result of the V-1 bombing. Number 6. The Junkers Ju-87. The Junkers Ju-87, often known as the Ju-87, was a World War II German light bomber that served as a dive bomber. Its crew consisted of a pilot and navigator who was also in charge of the mobile machine gun. The Ju-87 was capable of dropping 500 kilograms of bombs, and some of them were even modified to target tanks. We've all heard the classic screaming of a Junkers Ju-87 fighter as it approaches for the kill, whether we knew it or not. The aircraft uses the Stuka siren. Many of us have heard it in cartoons after a character falls from an incredible height. For others, though, it would become a signal of approaching death. This sound, produced by 2 tiny propellers on the gears, has become iconic for the Luftwaffe or World War II German Air Defense Squad. In fact, many Stuka pilots hated these sirens because they were as annoying to them as they were to the people they fought. They also had a habit of giving away locations and slowing the plane's speed during flight. Despite the Stuka siren's nuisances, they were highly successful in psychological warfare. The noise frightened opponents and caused them to drop whatever it was they were doing to get out of harm's way. During World War II, Ju-87 bombers were used to attack Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, and Greece. During the Battle of Britain, Junkers Ju-87 were used to assault Dover, Folkestone, and other English Channel ports. Many Ju-87s were used against Soviet soldiers in the Soviet Union and also to bomb during the Battle of Stalingrad. Number 5. MG-42. During World War II, machine guns were critical to combat success. Nothing like a modern assault weapon was seen on the battlefields until the final year of the war. As a result, specialized automatic weapons were critical for laying down heavy fire, both in offense and for defense. In the German Wehrmacht, it was known as the bone saw. It was dubbed the linoleum ripper by the Soviets because of the unique tearing sound it made. Americans called it the buzz saw. The gun we're talking about was the MG-42, which many believe to be the finest all-around machine gun in history. Its blazing rate of fire of 1,800 rounds per minute and the deadly 7.92 cartridge it fired earned it a notorious spot on the battlefields of World War II, It was so hated by the US troops that the War Department created propaganda training films to convince troops the MG-42 was overrated, but the weapon's sheer efficiency proved otherwise. In an oral history of infantry and armor operations in Europe, Orville W. Sonny Martin Jr., a second lieutenant in the United States Army 13th Armored Division, recalled, "It sounded like a zipper. It consumes a lot of ammo, which becomes a logistical challenge, but it also consumes a lot of people. Admittedly, the machine gun had flaws. It needed a lot of ammo to keep up, didn't have a single shot mode, and overheated fast. But the level of power it brought to the battlefield had disastrous consequences on enemies." Number 4. V-2 rocket. It was developed in Germany in 1936 by scientists led by Werner von Braun, and it was successfully released for the first time on October 3, 1942. The V-2 rocket was fired in Paris on September 6, 1944. The first of over 1,100 V-2 missions were fired at Great Britain 2 days later, and Belgium was badly bombed as well. Nearly 5,000 people were killed in V-2 attacks, and it's believed that at least 10,000 captives from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp died while being forced laborers in the subterranean Mittelwerk plant where the weapons were built. After the war, the US and Soviet Union seized considerable numbers of V-2s and used them in research that caused the creation of their missile and space programs. The V-2 was 47 feet long, weighed 28,000 to 29,000 pounds when launched, and produced about 60,000 pounds of thrust by burning alcohol and liquid oxygen. The payload weighed about 1,600 pounds, the horizontal range was about 200 miles, and the maximum height achieved was about 50 miles. So this was one heck of a rocket. On June 20, 1944, though, a V-2 rocket reached an altitude of 109 miles, making it the first rocket to ever enter space. Number 3. Air Raid Sirens. The Air Raid Sirens screamed at 4:56 p.m. on September 7, 1940, when the German Air Force began a devastating onslaught on London. Over 350 bombers flew over the channel from French airfields, dropping 300 tons of bombs on the docks and streets of London's East End. The Blitz was a series of strong and regular bombing strikes on London and other cities. German bombers targeted these British towns, ports, and industrial regions night after night from September 1940 until May 1941. People were notified of an air raid by loud sirens placed across towns and cities. During the Blitz, they were an almost everyday, terrifying occurrence. The sirens produced a lengthy and powerful signal or warning sound. For an alarm, the pitch of the siren was raised and lowered alternately. The siren's all-clear signal was continuous. Not every alarm meant a raid, and raids could occur even when no alert was sent out. People would stop what they were doing and head for a shelter when they heard an alarm. During the Blitz, life was extremely difficult and scary for most people. London was particularly horrible since it was bombarded basically every night. More often than not, people slept in air raid shelters. The shelters were created, and a blackout was strictly imposed after dusk to prevent Germans from seeing where the towns were. This meant that all light sources had to be turned off completely. For 11 weeks, London was attacked every day and night. 1/3 of the city was wiped out. The German Air Force dropped 5,300 tons of heavy explosives on London in just 24 nights during the first month. Swansea, Cardiff, Bristol, Southampton, Plymouth, Birmingham, Coventry, and Liverpool were among other cities and towns brutally struck. One deadly strike on Coventry in November 1940 was the world's largest air raid. There were 4,330 houses damaged and 554 people killed. During the night, 200 fires raged through the city. 32,000 civilians were murdered and 87,000 were badly injured during the Blitz. It ended in mid-May 1941 after most of Germany's air force was deployed east to prepare for Russia's nearing invasion. Number 2. Tiger tanks. The Tiger I's construction was underway in July 1942, and it first saw action against the Red Army in September 1942 near the village of Mga, located about 43 miles southeast of Leningrad. Later that year, in December, it faced off against the Allies in Tunisia. Due to poor factory production rates, though, incorporating these improvements took several months, meaning the Tiger I took almost twice as long to produce than other German tanks. The design was streamlined to assist production, which was partially due to raw material constraints. The Tiger's components were manufactured by a vast network of companies and then transported by rail to Henschel's facility in Kassel for their final assembly, with a total building period of 14 days. From July 1942 through August 1944, the Tiger was in production for 2 years. Only 1,347 Tiger I's were ever produced. After that, Henschel produced 490 Tiger IIs until the war's end. Any other battlefield machine made in such small quantities would have been quickly forgotten, but the Tiger's excellent combat performance made it worthwhile. The Tiger's front armor was 4 inches thick, and British personnel would watch rounds fired from their own tanks just bounce off the Tiger. 8 rounds fired from a 75mm wide artillery piece were supposedly ricocheted off the side of a Tiger from a distance of 150 feet during an early battle with the Allies in Tunisia. Meanwhile, at ranges of up to 1,000 meters, a shot from a Tiger's 88mm cannon could pierce 100mm thick armor. The Tiger was one of World War II's most feared weapons. In addition to its near-impervious armor, it could destroy an enemy tank from almost a mile range, and was even more effective on the right terrain, causing the Allies to put significant effort into following their movements. Only the German army understood how the Tiger functioned, and on Hitler's orders, damaged Tiger tanks had to be destroyed on the spot to prevent Allies from getting knowledge about the innovative weapons. Number 1. B24 Liberator. The consolidated B24 Liberator, often called the Model 32, is an American heavy bomber that saw substantial service during the World War II effort. In reality, it's the most manufactured heavy bomber and multi-engine aircraft in history. Despite being difficult to fly and having low speed performance compared to other bombers at the time, the Royal Air Force Liberators were the first aircraft to reliably travel the Atlantic Ocean. The B-24 played a variety of roles in the Allied war effort, including service in every sector of the American military as well as other armies and fleets. It was important to the United States strategic bombing campaign in Western Europe as well as the Pacific in Japan. The B-24 and other early bombers were made obsolete by better aircraft by the end of the war. There are just 13 Liberators left today, and several of them are out of commission or only half complete.
3. Operation Tidal Wave. On August 1, 1943, 178 B-24 Liberator bombers took off from the US Army Air Force's base in Benghazi, Libya, for the Romanian city of Ploiesti, 1,200 miles away. Dubbed Operation Tidal Wave, the mission's objective was to destroy a massive oil refinery complex, which was providing as much as 60% of the Axis fuel. It was planned by a man named Colonel Jacob Smart, who came up with the idea of dropping bombs on the plant from 200 to 800 feet in the air. Until then, the B-24 bomber had only been used for high-altitude precision bombing, because that's what it was designed for. Smart believed that the plan would take the Germans by complete surprise. To avoid tipping them off about the mission, the pilots maintained radio silence throughout their entire flight from Libya to Romania. Little did they know, the Nazis already knew they were coming. The region's Luftwaffe commander, Colonel Alfred Gerstenberg, had deciphered the American code that was used in Allied correspondence about the upcoming attack. He prepared for their arrival by encircling the city with several hundred anti-aircraft guns and protecting ground targets with barrage balloons attached to steel cables, which had the potential to do deadly damage to any B-24s that flew into them. The planes were traveling in 5 groups. According to Smart's plan, it was strategically crucial for them to all arrive at Ploiesti at the same time. But 2 of the groups used high power settings and unknowingly pulled ahead of the other formations. Because they were ordered to maintain radio silence, they couldn't communicate with each other to get back in sync. Another group followed the wrong visual cue along their route and mistakenly turned in the wrong direction, at which point some of the men broke radio silence due to the severity of the error. When the airmen began dropping bombs over the refinery's oil tanks, the flames from the ensuing explosions were higher than their planes. Ben Kiyoroki, who served as a gunner in the mission, told museum historian Tom Gibbs that he felt sure they were doomed and thought it was a miracle when their aircraft didn't catch on fire. Mac Gerald, who was flying in another Liberator, recalled seeing smoke all around them. Like Kiyoroki, he thought he was going to die and was shocked when he didn't. After shooting his plane down, the Germans captured him and his crew. The attack only lasted for about 30 minutes, but the losses were major, earning the costly operation the nickname of Bloody Sunday. 52 aircraft were shot down. Out of the 1,751 airmen who participated in the mission, 310 died, 130 were wounded, and more than 100 were taken prisoner. Between those who died, went missing, or were taken captive, roughly 30% of the men who set out for the mission didn't return. The Germans put forced laborers to work rebuilding the damaged refinery complex. Just weeks later, its oil productivity was even better than it had been before the attack. More than 8 months went by before the Allies once again considered an attack on Romania's oil industry. The disastrous mission serves as a reminder of Romania's major but often overlooked role in World War II. Led by a military dictator named Ion Antonescu, the country formally joined the Axis powers in November 1940. Antonescu was a loyal and reliable ally to the Nazis. Between 280,000 and 380,000 Jews were murdered under his regime, more than any other country except Nazi Germany. Before we continue with the other World War II missions that went wrong, remember to subscribe to American Eye for more videos like these. 2. Avenger Accidents. The Grumman TBF Avenger was the most effective and widely used torpedo bomber of World War II. It was developed during the early 1940s for service in the United States Navy and Marine Corps. It experienced many successes, including the sinking of the Japanese super battleships Yamato and Musashi, as well as 30 submarines. But the aircraft has also run into its fair share of trouble. When it first saw combat in 1942 during the Battle of the Midway in the South Pacific, 5 of the 6 Avengers involved in the fighting were lost. And while this didn't necessarily reflect the quality or effectiveness of the aircraft, it's hard not to wonder if anyone questioned the plane's abilities after the battle. This photo reportedly shows an Avenger next to the light aircraft carrier USS Bataan after a catapulting mishap on board and engine failure forced the pilot to ditch it in the water on March 13, 1944. If these details are correct, then it means that the incident happened while the Bataan was en route from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. The following year, a group of 5 Avengers mysteriously vanished during a routine naval training exercise off Florida. Led by experienced pilot and combat veteran Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, 14 airmen took off from Fort Lauderdale on December 5, 1945. They were supposed to follow a triangular flight plan that involved flying south over a place called Hens and Chicken Shoal, then heading north over the Bahamas and southwest back to base. The flight initially went as planned, but things took a bizarre turn after the pilots turned left to fly north for the second leg of their trip. For some reason, Lieutenant Taylor became convinced that his navigation equipment was malfunctioning and that they were flying in the wrong direction. To make things even worse, the group soon encountered heavy gusts and rain, which most likely made them even more disoriented. Taylor radioed the Naval Air Station and claimed that his compasses were out. He said that he thought his group was several hundred miles off course over the Florida Keys. But they weren't actually flying above the Gulf of Mexico like Taylor thought. They were out over the Caribbean Sea where they were supposed to be. The other pilots knew that something wasn't right. But there was no convincing him that his thinking was wrong, and the personnel back at base were unable to provide the Avengers' coordinates. Taylor ordered his fellow airmen to fly northeast, taking them further out to sea. He only became more disoriented from there, despite having received directions on how to navigate his plane toward Fort Lauderdale using visual cues. Later on, some officials would question why the trainees continued to listen to their clearly confused superior. The most likely explanation is that disobeying a superior is heavily frowned upon in the military, and in many cases it's punishable. At one point, the trainees convinced Taylor to go west, but he decided shortly thereafter that they hadn't traveled quite far enough east, and once again ordered everyone to fly in the wrong direction. Radio transmissions grew weak as the Avengers ran out of fuel. Taylor instructed his pilots to prepare to ditch. Taylor was last heard saying that they would have to ditch before communication stopped. A Navy search team immediately sprang into action and searched for the confused crew by boat. Not only have the downed aircraft never been found, the search team also vanished and was never seen again. It's likely that the wrecked planes are sitting at the bottom of the sea somewhere in the Bermuda Triangle, but their fate and Taylor's strange behavior that led up to it remain a mystery. World War II had officially ended just 3 months earlier, and the world was still very much entangled in its aftermath. But there's no reason to think that the pilots met with foul play, and most experts agree that they would have made it back to base if they'd just flown west when they were instructed to do otherwise. 1. Convoy Catastrophe. Throughout World War II, both the American and British militaries relied almost entirely on civilian merchant mariners to transport much-needed supplies to their destinations. These hundreds of thousands of brave volunteers received little recognition at the time, but they're now often thought of as the war's unsung heroes. They routinely put their lives on the line and experienced a much higher casualty rate than most other war-related jobs, despite not being in the military. Merchant vessels traveled in large, slow convoys. They were major targets for German U-boats. At first, convoys traveled unescorted or with little protection from just a few vessels that were equipped for anti-submarine warfare. The losses became so problematic that at one point, attacks on convoys threatened the entire war effort in Britain. In October of 1940, the consequences of the decision to provide merchant ships with inadequate protection became alarmingly clear. A convoy known as SC-7, consisting of 35 British merchant ships, left Newfoundland, Canada for Liverpool, England, with just a single sloop as an escort. To the frustration of the captains of faster ships, it puttered across the Atlantic at speeds as slow as 8 knots. The ships eventually became scattered. By the time the convoy's first vessels approached Ireland, more escorts had become available, but the ships had become so spread out that there was no realistic way to defend them all. 20 were sunk by U-boats, resulting in the deaths of crew members and the loss of 80,000 tons of cargo. The US eventually stepped in and helped protect merchant convoys by providing additional naval escort vessels. These protections were in place by the time the Allies began sending supplies to the Soviet Union in August 1941. The first few convoys to Russia were met with little resistance from the Germans. But traveling as a merchant mariner was still a tremendously dangerous job, especially as the Nazis dramatically increased their attacks against convoys. Merchants and sailors also faced the dangers of the unforgiving Arctic route, which was the fastest but most dangerous way to get supplies to the Soviet Union. One especially disastrous incident happened during the 17th convoy to the Soviet Union, known as PQ-17. Consisting of 34 merchant mariner vessels, an oiler and 3 rescue ships, it set out from Iceland for the port of Arkhangelsk on June 27, 1942. It was the most expensive convoy to set sail so far throughout the war, carrying more than $500 million worth of military supplies. The convoy's well-armed British and American escort included 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 minesweepers, 4 trawlers, 2 anti-aircraft ships, and 2 submarines. As soon as the ships were out on the open sea, a U-boat began trailing them. Even without the threat of an enemy force, sailing on a merchant vessel was fraught with hazards. In addition to facing brutal temperatures and often heavy seas, it was summertime in the Arctic, which meant 24/7 daylight and no protection from the cover of night. On any given clear day, the ships were in plain view of any German planes that might fly overhead. 5 days into the voyage, the Germans began attacking the vessels from both the water and the air. The attack steadily increased for 2 days, and 2 ships were sunk before the escort learned that another German battleship was on its way to intercept the convoy. The merchant ships were ordered to scatter while the escort moved further west. This was meant to make it harder for the Germans to sink the ships, but it had the exact opposite effect. It left the convoy more vulnerable to attack and without an escort for protection. The following day, on July 5th, the Nazis sunk 12 merchant vessels, and the carnage continued from there. Naval Armed Guard Seaman Donald Ross Nagatz was assigned with manning weapons on merchant vessels and was working on a ship called the Pan-Atlantic. On July 6th, the Germans bombed the ship, causing it to sink in just 3 minutes and leaving Nagatz at the mercy of the icy Arctic Sea. He found a raft with a dead body in it, threw the corpse into the water to make room for himself, and drifted for the next day until he was rescued. By the time he reached safety, his hands and feet were so swollen that his boots had to be cut off. The attacks continued for 5 days. When all was said and done, only 11 of the convoy's 34 merchant vessels reached their destination. In addition to the nearly 100,000 tons of cargo that were lost, including food and ammunition, the convoy lost 3,350 vehicles, 210 aircraft, and 430 tanks. Around 150 sailors and officers died. Sadly, it was later learned that the reports of a German battleship coming to intercept the vessels were false. The following convoy, PQ-18, also sustained heavy losses, and Soviet convoys were suspended for several months. We tend to remember World War II's most major combat events like D-Day and the attack on Pearl Harbor, and with good reason. But in doing so, convoy battles are often forgotten for their importance. The Allied war effort relied on these supply shipments. Without merchant mariner convoys and the military escorts who defended them, the war would have essentially been a guaranteed loss to the Allies. Getting shipments to the beleaguered Soviet Union became especially important after the Germans invaded Russia in 1941 in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. Altogether, 78 of these dangerous Arctic convoys were carried out, demonstrating the Allies' commitment to helping the Soviet Union. PQ-17 suffered the worst losses of any convoy throughout the war, including non-Arctic expeditions. When these shipments resumed after the losses sustained by convoy PQ-18, they were much better defended, but protecting merchant mariner vessels from the Germans remained a constant challenge. Thanks for watching. Which one of these mission failures shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.